Welcome everyone to our September Nature Talks. This talk is about getting swamped, the underappreciated world of wetlands. If it is your first time here, this is our monthly talks, and we do this on the first Tuesdays of every month with the rotating team. And this month it's wetlands. I am Unity Cooper. I am the Education and Outreach Assistant for Nature Nova Scotia. And we are very lucky tonight, folks, to be joined by Chad Simmons, ecologist at the Mersey Tobeatic Research Institute, MTRI, as he punches us into the wet, wild world of wetlands during Getting Swamped, the underappreciated world of wetlands. During this talk, Chad will introduce wetlands, their wildlife, and their importance, as well as what MTRI is doing to help conserve these ecosystems and improve Nova Scotia's policy. Wetlands are some of the most diverse environment in Nova Scotia. Wetlands reach ecological complexity, biodiversity, as well as benefits they provide to humans, such as water filtration and carbon storage, make them a priority for conservation. Yet, they're often underappreciated. So folks, if you have any questions, please send it in the chat, and Chad and I will try our best to answer your questions. We will be muting everyone so there's no disruption during the presentation. I am really excited for this presentation tonight because wetlands need to be protected. They play a key role in protecting water quality, reducing the impact of climate, in regulating greenhouse gases because they provide storage for carbon. So I'm looking forward to learning more about wetlands tonight and how we can conserve them and improve our province wetlands policy. So Chad, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got to MTRI, and we can go right into your presentation.
Sure. Well, for one, thank you. Thank you, Unity. Thank you, everyone, for joining me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Unity said, my name is Chad Simmons, and I'm an ecologist at the Mersey Tobeatic Research Institute. For anyone who has not heard of MTRI, we are a nonprofit nestled in the heart of Southwest Nova Scotia, just down the road from Kejimkujik. And our mission is to promote, sustain, and conserve biodiversity in Guestbowick, or Southwest Nova Scotia, as well as beyond. So I joined the MTRI team about 2 years ago, and I've done many jobs since, including working on old growth forests, invasive species work, loon patrols, SAR monitoring, and now I have grown into my role as leading our wetland work, as well as leading some of our outreach projects. So tonight I'm going to be introducing wetlands, going over MTRI's work, and walking you through some of the policy Nova Scotia has produced to protect these ecosystems. So already I know that most of you probably have a pretty good idea about what a wetland is, even though you might not be able to give a precise scientific definition. Wetlands are, of course, wet. Most of them are at least soggy, if not flooded, for much of the year. And if you're standing in one, chances are that your feet are getting a pretty good soaking. In the science world, we like to have a little more rigorous definition, and that usually is something along the lines of wetlands being referred to areas like marshes, swamps, bogs, or fens that either periodically or permanently have water levels near the surface, and they sustain aquatic processes as indicated by the presence of poorly drained soils, water-loving plants, and biological activities adapted to wet conditions. Now, sometimes the water in wetlands is not super obvious. For some, like vernal pools, they can dry out in midsummer and they may not fill up again until the fall or even next year. And many of our forested wetlands and floodplain swamps are relatively dry for much of the year and almost indistinguishable from upland drier forests. The size of wetlands can also vary quite a bit, from tiny ponds to giant peatlands that stretch for kilometers. And one of the most annoying things about wetlands, especially when you're trying to map them, is they often have these blurry borders. You can't really put a line in the sand and say on one side is a wetland and on the other is another ecosystem type. they gradually peter into other ecosystems like forests or waterways. So really the one consistent thing about wetlands is that they're always changing. And when you visit a wetland from week to week or season to season, you'll see many different personalities of the wetland that make up its overall character, from changing degrees of sogginess to the many different types of plants that flower there in different seasons, to the sorts of animals you're likely to see breeding or looking for food or hibernating there. It's this variable nature of wetlands that makes them especially interesting places to visit throughout their year, but it makes it particularly tricky to pin them down with precise definitions. So because of their tendency to bog people down, the incredibly important ecological value associated with wetlands has often been overlooked. So the European dominated mindset that arrived in Nova Scotia a few centuries ago saw wetlands more or less as wastelands, needed to be filled, cut, and converted into more productive farmland. And this practice was likely extensive across the province. It's hard to give exact numbers because it is a pretty tricky thing to pin down, but the general consensus is that roughly half of the wetlands that were in Nova Scotia pre-European contact have been lost. Of course, today we now realize that wetlands perform many important functions and services in our landscape, such as improving water quality, controlling floods, recharging groundwater, protecting coastal infrastructure from erosion, locking away carbon and helping us fight climate change, and of course, providing critical habitat for many rare and endangered species. Wetlands are among some of the most productive and diverse of all ecosystems on Earth, so the loss of them can mean the loss of species or populations of wildlife that depend on them for food or habitat. And because of many of Nova Scotia's wetlands have already been lost due to various activities, wetlands that remain take on even more of an important role. And a fun little fact I like to include is that an estimate for the benefits of wetlands in Nova Scotia it estimates, that wetlands generate roughly almost $8 billion in ecological services to Nova Scotians every year. And if you compare that to prominent industries such as forestry in the province, that particular field only generates around 700 million to Nova Scotia's GDP every year, and about $1 billion in our trading. So there's really no doubt about it. Wetlands, Nova Scotia is quite rich in wetlands. Based on the 2004 wetland inventory, Nova Scotia has just under 400,000 hectares of freshwater wetlands and just under 20,000 hectares of salt marshes. Over 3/4 of our wetlands are peatlands, also called bogs and fens. And the next most common types are shrub swamps and salt marshes. And some of our rarest are freshwater marshes, lakeshore wetlands, wet meadows, and seasonally flooded flats along rivers, which are often called floodplains. So because there's such a variety of wetland types present in the province that differ in appearance and location in the landscape, it can be quite tricky to know what someone's talking about when they say wetland. So I wanted to just spend a little bit of time going through the major types and including some of their features. So unsurprisingly, bogs are the first type I want to talk about, and they are also called peat bogs, named after the sphagnum moss that tends to dominate these ecosystems. And you can see a zoomed in version of a sphagnum moss here, very characteristically star-shaped when looking at it from above. The ground of bogs is really unaffected by precipitation because it's basically, the whole ecosystem is a giant sponge, and that soaks up any of the moisture that happens to end up in it. Bogs are usually fed by precipitation, fog, and snowmelt, and the water within them generally lacks nutrients and is quite acidic, sometimes reaching a pH of 4, which is roughly equivalent to a can of pop. Bogs can be treed, usually by black spruce or tamarack, but they can also be treeless and just covered in moss and some shrubs such as leatherleaf, huckleberry, and Labrador tea. There can also be smaller growing herbaceous plants such as pitcher plants and cotton grass that you'll tend to see more often in open bogs. And fens are very similar to bogs. They're still dominated by peat, but they usually are fed by streams and rivers. And because of that, they have a little bit more nutrients in the ecosystems. So marshes, on the other hand, are a little bit more dramatic. Their water levels can fluctuate daily, seasonally, or annually, and they can occasionally dry up, exposing their sediment. Instead of being fed by precipitation like bogs, they more often get their water from runoff, streams, storm surges, groundwater, and the tides. Their high nutrients support a lot of different plant life, and they generally have a faster decomposition rate, allowing more nutrients to be released in the soil and thus be available for more plant life. And this is why we often see them dominated by many grass-like plants such as sedges and rushes. On the other hand, some marshes don't have much of an organic layer because it tends to get washed away by storm surges. But in more stable marshes, such as those found on the edges of lakes, you can see a very thick layer of organic matter in the soil. And down here, you can see a picture of me collecting some soil samples from the field, and you can see that whole layer is a very thick organic layer that is built up from years and years of plants growing, dying, and then getting covered up. Salt marshes are a special subset of marshes that are regularly flooded by saltwater or inundated by salt spray. They are extremely productive wetlands that provide many critical environmental, societal, and economic functions and services. And their rich soils are why they have been targeted so much for diking to create rich farmlands, especially in the Annapolis Valley. So the next ecosystem I want to talk about is forested wetlands, often called swamps. And unsurprisingly, these are dominated by trees and shrubs. Their soils are usually rich wood peat or mineral soils, and that has a water table usually near the surface, and they may be seasonally flooded. They're generally not as wet as marshes and fens, as well as bogs, and they're more common along drier portions of floodplains and riparian areas along rivers and streams. They have a huge variety of nutrients, and the water can be quite acidic, it can be neutral, or somewhere in between. In shrub swamps, you're going to be shocked by this, but they are dominated by shrubs, such as alder. And in wooded swamps, trees dominate, but there's usually several other layers of vegetation, including shrubs, ferns, and a variety of herbaceous plants. And last but not least, we have vernal pools, which are pretty small. They're generally less than half a hectare in size. They're shallow, and they lack a permanent inlet or outlet, so the water just tends to collect after rainy weather. And they do dry out. Although short-lived and small, they provide critical breeding habitat for frogs, salamanders, many types of insects, and even some species of fairy shrimp. They're also important areas for feeding and drinking sites for birds, mammals, turtles, and other wildlife. Sorry, I'm just having a problem changing slides. There we go. So because there's such a diversity of wetland types, it's unsurprising that there's a huge diversity of wildlife that inhabit wetlands, including many species of plants, lichens, birds, reptiles, amphibians, you name it. Unfortunately, many of the province's species at risk are also wetland species, partially because so much of their habitat has been lost or altered due to human activities. And some of them include black ash, Blanding's turtles, boreal felt lichen, Canada warbler, eastern mountain avens, and eastern white cedar. Of course, wetlands are not just home to species at risk. There are many other species that live there, including more common red maple, tamarack, white ash, false Canada holly, huckleberries and blueberries, and many, many species of grass-like plants, and of course, many species of sphagnum moss. On the bird side, you can easily see many different species of ducks and great blue herons, as well as all of our turtle species, which rely on wetlands for either part or most of their life cycle, as well as many types of snakes. And of course, wetlands support many different species of insects, such as dragonflies and damselflies. So I wanted to take just a minute and talk about one of the biggest stars in the wetland world, and that's beavers. Not only do beavers create wetlands around their artificial ponds, they're also a vital tool to help us fight the effects of climate change. As beavers build their dams out of mud and sticks, the water behind it tends to build up and become deeper. This deeper water not only helps them get around more easily and keep away from predators, but it's also very useful for many other types of species. Deeper waters tend to be cooler, which for some species is critical, like river trout, which use these areas to escape the hot summer heat as they dive down into the cooler waters. The dams also significantly affect water circulation. As the water hits that dam, it's forced into the soil where it collects with colder groundwater and before resurfacing, which also has a cooling effect on the water. And because the dams really slow down rivers, it gives that water a chance to seep into the surrounding groundwater, providing quite literal reservoirs during droughts. And because the areas behind the dam tend to become wetlands, this area is now more wet, and it's much harder to burn during wildfires. When beavers are doing their thing, they're also carving out canals into the surrounding landscape, and it helps them move around more easily, but usually the water is not far behind them, and this creates a whole bunch of tiny streams, and these streams help the water get into the surrounding groundwater more, and it also has a cooling effect on the surrounding area because that water tends to be shallow and evaporate more easily, and that cools the area. And because of that, it's not surprising to have the areas surrounding a beaver dam be significantly cooler than the surrounding landscape. As well, when beavers are, doing their thing, their behavior creates a whole range of conditions in the area that's quite easy to see. When you go to a beaver dam, you generally see a mess around the beaver dam. But what's a mess to us is an opportunity for many other species of wildlife. As they're making all these streams and ponds, their dams and the muddy areas and more, that draws in more wildlife. All that complexity creates microhabitats, and that's usually a good attractant for many different types of species. So historically, beavers have had a really bad public image because they tend to make a mess by creating wetlands that interfere with our highways, our houses, and our businesses. But they might be our very unlikely best friend when it comes to dealing with climate change. So that about puts us halfway through my presentation and gives me a chance to take a breath and talk to you guys a little bit more. So does anyone have any questions? Do you have a wetland on your property? Are there any special wetlands around you that you want to name out? Or what's your favorite species? Let me know in the chat.
So we have a question in the chat, and this was an early question actually. So from Dory, they want to know, since most wetlands in Nova Scotia are probably owned privately, are there regulations around what one is allowed to do with them or not allowed?
So great question, and I'm really not surprised to hear it considering all the news lately. And that is the topic for my next slide. So we can get to that in just a sec if no one else has any questions.
Yeah, Tina said that Judy Q. CB has some amazing saltwater marshland.
Oh, I think that's in Cape Breton.
Yeah.
Saltwater marshes are amazing, especially for bird life. If you can get a chance to get out and look at some, you're probably going to see something really cool. They're great places. Okay. I don't think there's any more burning questions, so we can move on.
Okay.
So, policy. Now that you have a little bit better idea about what wetlands actually are, I think it's important to mention that policy. The policy the province has put in place. A lot of P's there around these ecosystems. So in 2011, the province released the Nova Scotia Wetland Conservation Policy, and it aims to provide a direction and framework for the conservation and management of wetlands in Nova Scotia. including on both private and Crown-owned land. The policy highlights the important roles wetlands play and their value to society. It also aims to manage the wetlands in a consistent manner to, quote, maintain a high level of wetland integrity for future generations while allowing for sustainable economic development. Overall, the policy aims to prevent the net loss of wetlands and their functions, which is an important component, in the province, and it designates certain wetlands as being special significance and have no loss within these special wetlands. So currently, to qualify as a special wetland, a wetland has to be either a salt marsh, a wetland within an already protected area, or a wetland known to support species at risk. If a development is to occur in or around a wetland, it has to be permitted by the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Climate Change. So here I've outlined some of the notable exceptions in our current wetland policy. So for example, an approval is not required for altering a wetland that is less than 100 square meters in total area, wetlands within agricultural drainage ditches, wetlands that develop as an unintended consequence of development of some sort or construction projects, but only projects after 1998. You also don't need a permit to put in a road that's less than 10 meters wide and overall less than 600 square meters. So this would be things like forestry access roads, secondary roads, as well as driveways. And you do not need a permit if you're harvesting trees or mowing agricultural fields in a wetland, although the policy does recommend using best management practices to minimize damage to the ecosystem. So the wetlands of special significance, those special wetlands that the province has set out to not impact at all, is one area that MTRI has been working with the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Climate Change to improve. As I mentioned, wetlands that support species at risk are designated as a wetland of special significance, or a WSS, but the government is working to figure out exactly how to do this, especially for some species that don't just stay put in a wetland. So this would include snakes and turtles, as well as mammals that, although rely heavily on wetlands, they also wander into forests and other ecosystem types. So in the spring, we submitted a big report that took me over a year, and it included procedures for incorporating a range of different species, including plants, birds, reptiles, lichens, and mammals into the wetlands of special significance. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time going over our results. So our recommendations included protecting all wetlands with a priority or lichen species. And we made these lists by sitting down with wildlife experts, and our plant list has roughly 200 species on it, and our lichen list has around 11. These species likely indicate a wetland is supporting a rare community, and many of the species included in our list are sensitive to human disturbance and require that their ecosystems remain intact to survive. So for example, on our priority plant list, we recommended including wetlands that have species such as white snakeroot, bog willow, swamp birch, skunk cabbage, southern twayblade, poison sumac, and several graminoids or grass-like plants. Our lichen list included species such as salted shell lichen, boreal felt, naked kidney lichen, peppered moon lichen, frosted glass whiskers, and blistered jelly skin lichen. And I basically just like to say those lichen names because they're fantastic. The lichen community outdid themselves with those. For the bird community, we recommended protecting all crown wetlands where a rare bird has been spotted and shows nesting evidence. For the reptiles, we got a little bit more complicated, and we recommended protecting all wetlands with a threatened or endangered reptile species. So this would be the blandings, the wood turtle, or the eastern ribbon snake, or wetlands that are an overwintering site for our other reptile species. So this would be the painted turtle or the snapping turtle, which are at less risk of extinction at the moment. And finally, for mammals, we recommended protecting all wetlands that have had a mainland moose sighting for obvious reasons. Moving forward this year, we're hoping to continue working with the province to continue developing the WSS and improving it. From our discussions, I can say the department is interested in better protecting biodiversity in wetlands as well as rare species, although at the moment we don't have a new contract, unfortunately. So the WSS and the wetland conservation policy are actually some of the strongest wetland policies in Atlantic Canada. Their goal is to achieve no net loss of ecosystems in the province and to permanently protect high conservation value wetlands. It deserves praise and admiration. We strongly encourage the government to continue prioritizing wetlands and developing additional protection policies. And these added protections are even more important considering the warming global climate and the global decline of biodiversity. So moving forward, we suggest working to protect wetlands that support all rare birds, not just those with nesting evidence, which can be missed because we don't have an army of biologists out surveying every wetland. We also recommend that future work looks at adding all wetlands within species at risk critical or core habitat into the WSS, because these areas are often important resources. They have important resources for wildlife at risk. Our rare mammals recommendation focused on moose because they had the most obvious dependence on wetlands of the rare mammals in Nova Scotia. But future work, we would like to see investigate if moose use all wetland types equally, or if certain types are more important and therefore require more protection. So overall, wetlands are diverse and varying ecosystems that transition into many other surrounding ecosystems. And it's difficult, as I mentioned before, to define their boundaries on a map, especially because of their complex hydrology. So it's quite critical to protect their surrounding ecosystems as well. We also can't effectively protect wetlands in this province if we only protect those on Crown land. We need incentives to private landowners to protect their wetlands as well as those that are publicly managed. It's gonna change slides in just a sec. There we go. So another area of wetland work and research that MTRI is working on is through the Gespuik Conservation Collaborative. This is the KCC. And it's a collection of partners, including government, NGOs, and researchers, focused on coordinating conservation efforts in Gespuik, and MTRI leads a number of ecosystem targets, including the forested wetland one. So the meetings on forested wetlands started in 2018 and have worked to ID threats and barriers to forested wetlands conservation. Earlier this year, we met to develop a list of key ecological attributes of interest for forested wetlands in Southwest Nova Scotia. And these attributes are just parts of an ecosystem's biology or ecology that, if altered or missing, would lead to the loss of that ecosystem. So basically, important components we need to conserve. And some examples of possible attributes that we came up with was the extent of forested wetlands in Nova Scotia, as well as the conditions and state of the buffers around these communities. As part of our KCC work, this year we're developing a research site inventory as well as a long-term monitoring project for forested wetlands in Gespuik. Our site inventory is exactly what it sounds like. It's a list of forested wetland sites in Southwest Nova Scotia with details about what these sites are like. So this project came out of our target meetings with the KCC, where it was routinely mentioned by researchers that they have a really hard time finding appropriate sites for their work. If a researcher is looking to, say, study the impacts of the invasive species glossy buckthorn, they have to spend a lot of time going out and hoping to find these sites that meet their needs. So this has really been a big roadblock to important research. With our inventory, we want to cut back this wasted time and resources and give researchers all the details they need to know for our sites. And of course, it also gives us an opportunity to go out and collect wildlife community data and get a better understanding of these ecosystems overall. So with our inventory, we're collecting information about a site's, the conditions in and around a site. So is there forestry? Is there agriculture? Are there roads nearby? What's the wildlife community like the plants, the lichens, the amphibians? And another important factor that we're monitoring is the environmental conditions. So what's the soil like? How thick is that organic matter layer? Things around that nature. So that's our inventory. And later this year, we're going to begin work on our long-term monitoring project. And it's very early stages of development, but we're likely going to include details about the wildlife community, including the insects, which are a really underreported group of study in Nova Scotia, as well as the climate. So we want to record things like the temperature and humidity in wetlands and see how these are changing over time. So although it sounds kind of obvious and a little bit boring, maybe to some, not me, long-term monitoring projects are really the gold standard in ecosystem conservation, and they can tell us a lot about how ecosystems are changing over time. Having a monitoring program will allow us to see how wetlands are changing from things like climate change or even invasive species, and will allow us to start work to either prevent damage to these ecosystems or mitigate it as best we can. So that about sums up my little rant to everyone. But I want to leave you with the take-home message that wetlands are really worth their weight in gold. They offer so much to humans and all the other species that we share the province with. And I highly recommend visiting them and getting to know them a little bit better. They have so many faces, and I have really yet to see a wetland that reminds me of one I've already seen before. And if you're lucky enough to own a wetland on your property, I highly recommend conserving it as best you can. As a society, we really need to be maximizing the protection of these ecosystems for a variety of reasons. So if you would like to visit a wetland near you, you can check out this great program offered through Ducks Unlimited. It's called the Treasure Wetland Program. And it's really an interactive map of different sites across Nova Scotia, and it highlights significant wetlands that are quite accessible, have usually good trails and lots of signage, and they're all really wonderful to visit. So with that, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. And do you have any questions? Oh, and there's my email if you have questions later and want to ask.
Thanks, Chad. So we have some questions in the chat. Ken wants to know what type of nesting evidence is necessary for birds. So a bird singing on territory or a higher level such as finding a nest?
It's really any indication that there is nesting going on. So this could be breeding calls or breeding behavior, or sometimes even really defensive bird behavior that indicates that a nest is nearby, or it could include the obvious sign of seeing a nest. And that really came about because when bird ecologists are out surveying for birds, they tend to record the type of behavior they see. I'm not super familiar with the practice, but I know that a category of those observations are like confirmed breeding evidence. And that's the kind of sighting that we flagged as being important to kind of conserve that wetland.
Great. So if they were to find evidence, I've seen an actual nest, who do they contact to report that sighting?
The public?
Yes.
Yeah. So iNaturalist is always a good source because we tend to look at that data. But if anyone uses eBird, that's a really good resource to like get some very thorough information about birds and areas. So the province uses the kind of scientific system. So they receive data from the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center. And that's basically where everyone who does scientific research in ecology and conservation sends their data at the end of the year. And those folks, they sum it all up and then they'll produce maps. And those maps will have basically sightings of everything anyone's seen in the scientific world that year. And they're huge, huge files. but we are able to go through them and select certain species, rare species, or particular bird or any taxa of wildlife. And so that's the official channel to designate WSS at the moment. But as a community scientist, yeah, eBird, iNaturalist are great ways to do that.
Okay. So since we're on this topic, so the long-term monitoring program, I'm just wondering, like, I know they monitor the changes in wetlands. Does that include like human impact too on wetlands? Because just a few months ago, I had a workshop at Belcher Marsh, and the water traveled a very long way, and some part of the way the water traveled, there was like a little pond that was created, and I'm sure beaver has some hand in that as well. But we noticed there was some goldfish in the pond, so like, yeah, so I think the folks that live in the apartment building around the wetlands probably put their goldfish in the pond. There was about like 2 or 3 that we saw that day. So like in that case, who do we like tell to?
So that would be, I'm not sure if goldfish are technically considered an invasive species, but they can definitely cause damage to ecosystems. And for anyone listening, please don't release goldfish. That would be something to send the province, probably the Department of Environment and Climate Change. You can also flag Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council. They would know. Actually, they have a button on their website that says report an invasive species. So that's an easy way to report it. And then their staff can flag the appropriate government officials.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So we have more questions. Jillian wants to know, is your WSS report available to look at?
It's a good question. If you send me an email, I can send it to you. So the province did hire us to do that, but it is, so MTRI, when we sign a contract like that, we do retain rights to all of the data and the research we use. So yes, I can send that to you. And I'm just going to put my email in the chat so it's easy for anyone to send me an email request. It's a long report though, and it's a little bit boring, but there are summaries, so you should be okay.
Great. And also too, we could provide Chad email if you don't get it after this talk as well. So Anna wants to know, what kind of response are you getting from private wetlands owners in your efforts to conserve them?
It ranges. It really depends on the people who own the land. Some landowners are not at all interested in working with us and are actually quite hostile, and others are incredibly caring, incredibly knowledgeable, and want to do everything they can. So it really ranges quite a bit. I'd say overall, though, most people, they don't want to damage the ecosystems they're living in. But sometimes, say if they're doing forestry and that's a livelihood for their family, they are willing to potentially cause damage. And I also included a link to the Treasured Wetland program, so you should be able to check out some really cool wetlands near you in the chat.
Lisa says she lived on the Lake Jerry, blogs, marshes, and swamps, and lots of milkweeds. Beaver dams create perfect milkweed habitat. More monarch this year than ever.
It's great to hear.
Jenny says, thanks, Chad, for your enjoyable and informative presentation.
Thank you, Jenny.
Ken wants to know, how is your organization funded, and is your work restricted mostly to SWAN, Nova Scotia, to SW, Nova Scotia?
Yes, so we are a nonprofit and we are mostly funded through the federal government through a whole bunch of different funds. Our work focuses on species at risk a lot, but we also do tackle old growth forests, bats, lichen work. We have some contracts with forestry to survey areas before a harvest to potentially find rare lichens and put in buffers if that's the case. We also do get some funding through the province and through private companies such as TD, which allows us to do a lot of our outreach. So it's really quite a mishmash, but most of it is federal funding.
Tina wants to know, is there anyone collecting data in northern Nova Scotia / Cape Breton, or anyone to reach out to discuss protecting private marshland?
I assume you mean, Tina, collecting data on wetlands. Other than the province, I don't think so. I can't think of any groups that are kind of nested up there. As far as reaching out to discuss protecting private marshland, that's a good question. So Ducks Unlimited would potentially be a good source. And if you know if there are rare species, there's also the Nature Trust that might be interested, although I can't speak on behalf of them. But those two groups would probably be your best bet. Oh, and getting back to Ken's question, I forgot to mention MTRI is mostly focused on Gespuik, and that's because Southwest Nova Scotia is a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve because of all of the biodiversity. So Nova Scotia in general is quite full of many different species of wildlife, but Southwest Nova Scotia, I can brag, we're doing real well when it comes to our biodiversity.
Tina said thank you. Anna says that was really interesting. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Folks, do you have any question, you can use your mic if you want to, or you could put it in the chat. You mentioned, Chad, during your presentation that swamp was like the force of wetlands. I was just curious, why are they considered like the force among all the wetlands ecosystems?
Sorry, can you say that again, Unity?
Yeah, I think when you were talking about this wetland swamp ecosystem, you said they're like the force of wetlands.
Oh, I maybe said forested wetlands.
Oh, okay. That's what you
Swamps
said.
are commonly called forested wetlands. In my wetland focused world, we often refer to them as forested wetlands.
Okay.
That was probably me. I was probably slurring my words a little bit.
I probably misunderstood. All right. Well, thank you so much, Chad, for being with us tonight. And what an amazing and really interesting talk. I'm motivated to get into action to do more about protecting our wetlands.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming.
Folks, if you don't have any questions, then we will leave it there for now. But if you have any more questions, we would definitely make sure you get Chad's email. And if you're not following Nature Nova Scotia or MTRI on social media, definitely do and check out their website. See you all the first Tuesday of next month for our next nature talks. Thank you. Bye.